Go. So we're going to continue. Program is being recorded for it, and if we could bring up. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Fred Haise, astronaut from Apollo 13. A very stressful time during our nation's history then, trying to get the astronauts back safely. And here we have the same sort of stress on our nation here where we have major health concerns. So here it is, an excellent time to discuss some of the achievements that they were accomplished in Apollo 13. Fred Haise not only flew Apollo 13, but he helped in the flights of the test flights for the space shuttle landing area. So a very accomplished engineer, pilot, astronaut. So take it away, Fred.
Good morning, everyone. I think most of the group, age-wise, I think it's where I was probably about 75 years ago, a long time ago. And I was very fortunate growing up in Biloxi, Mississippi, to end up on the course of the career I did, becoming in the military during the Korean War, a pilot, a fighter pilot with the Marine Corps. And subsequently went to work for NASA just about the time they became NASA. They had been NACA, more an aircraft test business. And I started at Lewis Research Center in Cleveland for NASA as a test pilot. And I had 7 years in that line of duty for NASA, both at Cleveland, Ohio, as well as their center at Flight Research Center. Which was really their biggest test operation, aircraft test operation, before I had decided to join the astronaut program. Neil Armstrong was ahead of me in that same path. Neil had started also as a NASA NACA, actually, when he joined test pilot at Lewis. And then he joined Flight Research Center at Edwards, and then into the astronaut program. So I trailed Neil about 2.5 years in that path. And incidentally, the Flight Research Center now is named after Neil Armstrong Flight Research Center. So I was very lucky to have gotten into the flying business with the experience I had in fighter squadrons and as a test pilot to join the astronaut program in 1966. I flew Apollo 13, but I trained for 2 previous missions. I trained to go fly Apollo 8. The backup crew I was with on 8 was Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. We were the backup on 8. And then I cycled as a backup with Jim Lovell and Ken Mattingly to fly Apollo 11, the first landing mission. And then finally was going to get my chance to fly Apollo 13. Now, I'd have to say Apollo 13 was thought to be, I would say, routine, but it was going to be the 3rd landing mission, planned landing mission on the moon. So it wasn't that notary as much as, say, the first landing on Apollo 11. But we had something unusual before we got started. Within a week before launch, it was determined that we had all been exposed with measles through a backup, my backup actually, Charlie Duke, had been at a birthday party with his son and had been exposed and told the medics about it. So we did a lot of blood sampling every morning to finally determine that we would have to change out one crewman, Ken Mattingly. So unfortunately, after having trained the whole cycle before on 11 and now for 13, Ken was removed from the crew 2.5 days before launch. Jack Schweigert replaced him. Now, this was not a technical or safety or mission success thing to do because I had trained on 8 and 11. I can tell you as a backup, I was ready to go fly the mission. So it was not a loss in that sense. It was obviously a personal, great personal disappointment for Ken to be pulled off that late. And of course, Jack, on the other hand, had a little problem with no time to invite his friends and family to the launch, prepare a package of items he may have wanted to take on the flight for friends and family. So he kind of lost out on that accord to go to fly this mission. I don't know if we can have the next slide. This shows the crew that morning on April 11th. It's this coming Saturday to head out to the launch pad. We're leaving the building called the Operations and Checkout Building to climb aboard this van to take us out to the launch pad, probably some 10 miles away. We're carrying those little containers because the spacecraft operated on 100% oxygen. And so we were breathing at this time 100% oxygen, which helped prepare us for the launch and reduce pressure in the capsule, which was going to be decreased to 5 psi versus where we all are here on Earth right now. We're at about 14.67 psi. And that's the way we operated the spacecraft, which helped us reduce structural weight. So here we are, three of us heading out with a decal you see on the door. And incidentally, I got after sometime after the flight. So I have that memento of that day. Next slide, please. Okay, the launch, this is a Saturn V. By this time, there had been a number of these flown. I say a number, not that really that many, but it's a big rocket. If you lay it on its side, which is where it's displayed right now at Johnson Space Center, at Marshall and Huntsville, Alabama, and at Kennedy Space Center, this thing is 363 feet, which on the side, it virtually covers a football field, plus both end zones. We sat right up in that little bitty capsule you see way up on the tippy top, and there's a pole sticking out above that. That's our escape rocket, just in case we had to abort, even off the launch pad. Off the launch pad, that escape rocket, if we used it, would carry us up to about 6,000 feet and was canted a little bit, so it'd take us out over the Atlantic. So we'd have from 6,000 feet, we could get our chutes out and splash down in the ocean right off the launch pad there. But at any rate, the first stage engines, 5 of them you see running, generate about 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The rocket did not move away very swift. It was very slow. In fact, real-time photos of this launch almost looks like slow motion. The reason is the entire rocket at the time of liftoff weighs over 6 million pounds. So it's a pretty heavy thing. And even those 7.5 million pounds thrust from the engines couldn't get it moving too fast right off the bat. From the flying airplanes, this ride on the rocket, probably the most unusual thing was the steering, which was done by gimbling the engine. That is, moving the engine to left and right, or fore and aft, to keep the rocket going in the right direction. With those big engines, the four outer ones, when they moved, it gave you kind of a herky-jerky feeling or motion when you're way up on the top there in a capsule, probably exaggerated because you're way away from those engines. And that was not normal from a standpoint of all the vibration or oscillations I'd ever felt in airplanes. The G levels, though, did not get above 4.5 Gs through the whole launch. So that was really, compared to, again, my fighter airplane experience, not as much as I'd experienced in combat maneuvering practice, up to like 6 or 7 Gs in an aircraft. So that was not that traumatic. But we did have one problem on the way uphill. On the second stage, which also has 5 engines, smaller ones, that are liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, the center engine quit 2 minutes early. It shut down automatically because of a POGO, a liquid flow oscillation that had been encountered that caused a chugging motion and enough to vary the chamber pressure to a point the auto shutdown occurred. We worried a little bit about that at the time because we thought we'd use too much fuel to get to orbit and we might not be able to have enough left in the third stage to head out to the moon, but we did. Next slide. All right, this slide now you're looking at in low Earth orbit. We did go into low Earth orbit and we went around 2 times in low Earth orbit at about 105 miles, I think it was. The landmass you see there is Baja California, sticking out below the state of California. And the one thing I'll say, next slide, that was different, radically different from anything experienced in an airplane were these kind of scenes. You know, I've been in fighter airplanes and airplanes that can get up to 45,000. I had done Zoom flights in a 104 up to about 80,000 feet. But it's still nothing like this view, for instance, where you're looking at the Earth now out about probably 25,000 miles on our way out toward the moon. It's interesting that, again, that landmass you see below California sticking down that like finger, that's again Baja California, which you saw in the low Earth orbit picture. Above that, you see a streak of white. That's snow on the High Sierra Mountains in California. Next slide. And I don't see a picture here. It might be covered up by what I see on things here. Let's see. Let me X out. I guess that's a smaller Earth that gets smaller as you head out toward the moon. The one thing about the Earth too, as you see later pictures around the moon, is it's a very colorful body, beautiful body. You can see the blues of the oceans, cloud patterns, land masses, continent level size land masses. Whereas the contrast, you'll see shortly, the moon is radically different. At certain angles on the way out, we could see a sunlight glint on the thin atmosphere around the Earth that constitutes our total atmosphere. It almost looks like a halo around the moon, around the Earth rather. Next slide. Now you're looking at the moon. This is on the backside. This is what you never get to see from Earth. The way the moon rotates in its 28-day journey around the Earth, it always keeps one face toward the Earth. So we only see the front side from the Earth. This is now the backside, and that large dark feature that you see there is the Sea of Moscow. The Russians sent the first spacecraft around the moon without people. It was unmanned, and they shot a lot of pictures. So that gave them naming rights, so to speak. And so they got to name some of the major features on the backside. Next slide. This is a very beautiful feature on the backside. This is Tsiolkovsky. That's the name of a Russian early rocket scientist, much like Dr. Goddard was in the United States. So this crater got named after him. We're passing around the backside of the moon here at about 130 miles above the moon. We only got one pass as we went around the moon. And we were, at this point, we were on a path that would have got us back to Earth, but we'd have landed in the Indian Ocean had we not done anything at this point, near Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. Next slide. And continuing on around, you see most of the backside is one difference, obviously, is it's very, very rough terrain almost everywhere. Only a very few of those large dark features I showed, like Sea of Moscow, Tsiolkovsky, whereas on the front side we look at, there are some very large dark areas they call seas on Mars, M-A-R-A-S, where very large impact craters hit some time ago, eons ago. And it appears there's as many of those very large meteorite impacts on the backside. So most of the terrain is very rugged, just craters after craters after craters. I'm sure if you went on down to lower, better resolution, you would see even smaller craters than the ones you see here. The moon also, as you can see, is not very colorful, as like the Earth is. It's kind of grayish colors. Some here and there you'll see a darker gray, and occasionally even a lighter tint of gray, which I assumed was where something more recent had impacted, and it was sort of a fresh spill out of the regolith, which is the soil on the moon. Next slide. And again, a parting shot as we're going around the moon again at about 130 miles. What you're looking at here is the vehicle segment you see there is the bottom skirt of our command module. In fact, that's the hatch of the command module you're looking at on that rounded area. And right below, right around the corner from that is our heat shield. The little probe you see up to the left there sticking out with a white tip is a VHF or UHF antenna on the lunar module. And this is actually taken from the lunar module window, looking down at the landscape on that rugged backside. Next picture. We did stage just before the explosion happened, a TV show. And this is myself on the screen there in Mission Control with the people there enjoying the show. The mission had gone very routine, gone very well to this point. In fact, at one point, the Capcom called us and said they were getting bored to death down in Mission Control. But anyway, we staged this TV show, which the networks here in America did not carry. Already, this was old news, I guess. And of course, that changed with the explosion. And after this TV show, the plan was we were going to go to bed, have a night's sleep, wake up in the morning, go into lunar orbit, power up the landing craft, and go land on the moon. So that was the next sequence of events planned. Of course, hardly after we shut down this TV show, stopped it, Jack Swigert was asked to stir the cryos, which is a little egg beater inside the cryogenic oxygen hydrogen tanks to stir them up, which gives a better quantity reading for the ground to see. And an electric short occurred in one of the oxygen tanks. We had two tanks, and the short happened in tank 2 and caused the explosion. And you see a picture of that later, which ripped off a large segment of the service module. And the big problem was it immediately shut down 2 fuel cells. And so we had serious electrical problems to deal with. Now, frankly, the main concern and the feeling I had was disappointment at that point, because I knew it was an abort to lose that tank. We did not think it was life-threatening, because we really thought we had a second oxygen tank. Tank 1 was intact, and it would just keep everything powered up and come home. But as it turned out, whatever it hit, shrapnel particles, caused a slow leak in the second tank. And so it was gradually being depleted. So that made things quite different. We were now in an emergency situation, because losing that second tank meant we'd lose all the fuel cells and really all our power. We had to preserve 3 small batteries that remained to get us through entry. They were there just for that purpose, to get you through entry and get the chutes out before you splash down in the ocean. So we had to power down the command module, which we called the mothership. And in that sense was never, ever supposed to be powered down in space. Had never been done so. So there was some scrambling there, first troubleshooting for a while to try to stop the leak in that second tank, tank 1. And after about almost an hour, it was obvious everything had been tried, people on the ground could think of to do that, and knew it was gonna get fully depleted. And so Jack Swigert, actually by that time we had left Jack, and went to power up the landing craft, because it was another vehicle, was obviously made to land on the moon. And in that sense, for the mission, only made the last 2 days. So we had a good spacecraft now to operate from, a lifeboat. Our lunar module, LM7, we called Aquarius, but we had a secondary problem now to deal with, and that this 2-day machine, we now had to keep operating for 4 days, because that's how long it was going to take us to get back home. So Jack powered down the command module completely to preserve the batteries, and 3 of us ended up in the lunar module for most of those next days. Go ahead. This is Jim Lovell, commander, asleep here on the left side with his arms kind of tucked in. I'm sure he's got his leg around a cable that was normally meant to hook up to your spacesuit to hold you in place, to keep him from drifting off in his position. The climate got very cold. I don't know what temperature exactly we went down in the landing craft, because there was no thermometer or temperature gauge. The water tanks froze in the mothership. So I don't think where Jim is and where we were in the lunar module was quite freezing. It was probably in the mid 30s, 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And we did not have adequate clothing for that situation. We got out our spare sets of underwear, had a couple others, and so I ended up with wearing three pairs of underwear, which helped, under this 2-piece suit. Now, some people ask, why didn't we get on our spacesuits? In a spacesuit, it's a rubberized interior, and if you get into that suit, even in a temperature of mid-30s, you would perspire without cooling air. And we only had 1 set of hoses free in the lunar module. There really were only 2 sets normally for 2 crewmen, but we only had 1 set that was free. And so only 1 person could have had the cooling in the suit. And if you didn't, you'd perspire. And then if you went to the bathroom to get out of that suit, you'd freeze to death. So mutually, Jim decided that we should all suffer together. And so none of us got into our spacesuits, but rather put on our spare underwear. It also got very damp. Water was around in various wiring bundles we could see, and at connector interfaces. Because we were breathing out moisture. When you breathe out air, you're breathing out moisture. And the water separator, which the vehicle had, was not made to operate at that cold temperature. So water was building up over things. Next slide. And here's Jack Schweigert in the back. He ended up huddled with us in the landing craft. Right to his left shoulder, you can see a box with gray tape. That's a fix. Jack and Jim actually did that to utilize a different shape lithium cartridge from the command module. We had an abundance of them there, but we did not have enough in the LEM to handle 4 days. So there was a fix made with people on the ground figured out, and actually tested it in a vacuum chamber to assure it would work properly before sending up instructions for Jim and Jack to fabricate this box with tape around it and using cellophane for my clothing, stiff cellophane to form a plenum, and taped it up to the intake hose on the LEM. And that allowed the air to be sucked through this cartridge and to cleanse our air of building up carbon dioxide. It's a problem you'd have in any closed space. ISS, currently the space station, it has a different system. It doesn't use cartridges, but it has to have a cleansing system in place to do the same thing, to get rid of carbon dioxide buildup for the crew up there. And the same way on a submarine. Submarine has to deal with that same condition where they stay underwater for long periods of time. They have to worry about carbon dioxide buildup from the crew breathing on the submarine. Next slide. Another picture of Jack and Jim here with their fabrication, finished fabrication of that box. And another challenge was to jury rig the set of hoses to store urine on board, because we got an instruction a little over a day from Splashdown. We could not dump urine overboard anymore. It was messing up tracking data. Now, what we misunderstood was they meant to not dump urine for the next few hours. Well, they got tracking information, and we thought they meant forever. And so we had to jury rig several ways to do that. Right behind Jack and Jim in the middle, again, you'll see that box, the square lithium cartridge from the mothership that was being taped up there, hooked up to a hose, the intake hose, to cleanse the air. The lunar module had a round cylindrical shaped cartridge. And like I said, there just wasn't enough of those in the LEM to handle 4 days' time. Jack, incidentally, was the command module pilot. So all his time had been spent training to fly that vehicle. In fact, in the normal mission, the command module pilot would be left alone in lunar orbit while the two crewmen landed on the moon. So he was very proficient and knowledgeable about the mothership, the command module. But as it turned out, this was the first time he had ever been in the lunar module. He had never been in one, even on the ground. So this was kind of a new thing for Jack. Next slide. This scene is the pretty graphic picture of the damage area where the oxygen tank 2 exploded. That lower section of the service module should look just as shiny and smooth as that upper portion. That's basically where 1/4 of the spacecraft blew off. And you can't see the detail here, but we could see broken lines, shards of thermal blanket ripped and torn. Thermal blankets are things that handle the heat and cold variations in space. It's a material that's multi-layered, and the explosion had torn apart a lot of that. So we could see there was extensive damage in that area. And fortunately, the impulse of the explosion went outward, as you can see, to blow off that whole panel on that side, rather than inward, where there were the propellant tanks for the service propulsion engine. And had it penetrated the wall inward, we would have had a much bigger problem. Next slide. And of course, we had a happy ending. This is in the South Pacific, where they finally managed to get us back to a right recovery area near the Samoan Islands. The 3 main chutes came out, as you see beautifully. We did not tip the capsule over after landing. It was still very cold inside, even after this entry. So the heat shield did a very good job. In fact, when they recovered the capsule on board the aircraft carrier and inspected it, they found the water tank still frozen. When the frogmen who got in the water, they're actually Navy SEALs, some, and safed the spacecraft and opened the hatch, a cloud of frosty air poured out of the capsule. And I can tell you, it felt great to be there in that warm South Pacific climate all of a sudden from those 4 days sitting in that refrigerator, so to speak. But we were recovered on board the ship. Another amazing thing about this entry was, we had effectively abused the command module, the mothership. We turned it down, turned it off, we'd froze the water tank, so we had exceeded most of the specifications for all the electronic equipment, grossly exceeded the design requirements. And yet the vehicle came back to life when we activated it, and we tied for the second most accurate splashdown of the program, fully controlled through the computer. It was all automated. Jack Swigert monitored it, of course, and was ready to manually take over. But the auto system through the computer coming back to life worked perfectly. And here we were with this tied for the second most accurate splashdown of the whole program. So it was another kind of minor miracle that everything still worked as it should after abusing it for 4 days. Next slide. Here we are with the hatch had been opened and we were exited. Jim Lovell, you see, pointing to me. I was, since I was ill, I had developed a urinary tract infection about a day and a half out. I had burning when I urinated and had chills and fever, much kind of like having the flu. I wasn't incapacitated, but I certainly didn't feel well. And Jim here is pointing to get me in the basket there, you see, on the side of the raft, to get me up to the helicopter first. So, and all ended up, all three of us went up that way in this rescue basket, which is still used, I guess, by the Coast Guard for rescuing people in capsized sailboats or boats in the oceans or the Gulf. Next slide. Celebration here of all the people here in Mission Control. After talking to some about our experience, both down here on Earth and ours in flight, it was obvious that some of them with key assignments to try to solve things, to work around, had gotten probably less sleep than I had gotten in flight. They were really under the gun to do some extraordinary things and thinking new ways of doing things quickly. Much more quickly than what had ever been done in the normal scheme of things. And so they kind of worked till most of them said they just worked until they got tired enough that they wasn't thinking clearly. And then they'd take a short nap, if you will, and then go back to work. Next slide. And this is us coming on board the ship, climbing out of the helicopter. They, of course, had our new flight suits ready and ball caps to put on to come on out and join the crew on the aircraft carrier, which was the Iwo Jima, was the name of that carrier. It had been on combat duty in Vietnam in the war and was asked to route south on its way back to home port in San Diego, California. And it swung by to pick us up after our splashdown. Next slide. I think that maybe it's the last one or one more. Oh yeah, this is from the carrier. The next morning we helicoptered into Samoa, had some ceremonies there, and then an Air Force C-141 transport aircraft flew us to Hawaii, where President Nixon had flown out with US-1 through Houston, where he made an award to the Mission Control team and picked up our wives, at least Jim and my wife, Jim's wife Marilyn and my wife Mary. And Jack was not married. Jack was a bachelor. And he flew them with him on Air Force One out to Hawaii to greet us and give us an award of the Presidential Award. So that's where we are here in Hawaii. And I think that's the end of the slideshow. Now, only comment I'll make is something akin. Apollo 13 was obviously the big picture was a story of people in trouble, some challenges that had to be made and affected by many people, not just ourselves and not just Mission Control. There were people beyond Mission Control that got involved with working through some of these things that had to get figured out. But the only thing I can relate to the worldwide situation now is, again, another unexpected happening with this threat of the virus. And similar to Apollo 13, we've been asked to do things that aren't the normal mission, outside the normal mission, and do things differently. And we had to be adaptive and accommodate doing things and some that we had not trained to do. And we had to accept that and do the best we could to deal with that situation. And that's much of what the world is being asked to do in many places today. This keeping safe distance from people, staying home absolutely as much as possible. And it's the way, if we all work with it and adapt and do the right things that we're asked, we will overcome, and this virus will be a thing of the past before too long. Anyway, I'm not sure where we are, about right on time, I guess, to maybe open it up for questions. Is that okay?
Yes, you're right on time, and thank you very much. I'm sure that everyone is grateful that you give us your time today to talk to everyone about your experiences. So we're going to reopen the chat room up, but we ask everyone to keep it to professional questions only. Don't do social chatting. We would like to give as many people a chance to ask questions. What we'll do is we'll see it on the chat, and then we will read out your question to Fred here. And as we get going, let me ask the first question, and it's a little bit two parts. Is that, yeah, you were sick on the flight halfway through it. How did that affect you? You're probably the first one with a urinary infection in space. What was that like compared to what your own experiences were? And we get to see that in the movie Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks. How realistic was that for you?
Well, yeah, they probably the only thing that the movie showed that Jim Lovell didn't hug me. But other than that, it was, you know, like I said, the symptoms are very much like having the flu. So you don't feel well, but you know that some of you out there maybe have even had the flu. It doesn't make you lie in the bed forever. You can get up and you can do things. And so I was not incapable of doing what I needed to get done, including through entry. If I needed to do things, say something went wrong, I was capable of handling it. But it was miserable, primarily with the chill, the cold. The fever side wasn't bad, but when I got to the chill side, man, I was just shivering like a dog. It's shivering. I see, dog gets cold, it shivers, shakes to warm itself. Well, that's kind of the way I was at that point. So it was not pleasant, but I was not incapacitated.
Okay. I think Sam wanted to know, at any stage, were you afraid during the mission?
I was not afraid. Like I said, the biggest emotion I felt was disappointment. When we got to the first maneuver, which was at about 60-something hours, this happened at 55 hours, the explosion. 60-something, I think 63 hours, we did the first, I call it a burn, where we used the LEM landing engine, the descent engine, and we changed our path. And because at that point, we were not on a path that would have got us back to Earth. We made the burn that got us back to go around the moon at that 130 miles. And as I said, we were on a path that would have got us back to an entry at Earth in the wrong ocean. We'd have been in the Indian Ocean, but nevertheless back home. Jim Lovell asked me to compute the consumables. That is how much oxygen, how much power, how much water we had. Could that last for the time remaining, which at that time was a little over 4 days. I made those rough calculations on using a blank pad we had. And I figured we'd make it on power, and that was a longer return, because later on we did another maneuver that took 10 hours off the return. But even with the longer return, I made it on power with the batteries in the lunar module. I ran out of water about 5 hours before what would then be the entry. And I did not even compute oxygen. We had lots of oxygen, more than we ever needed. We had 2 full backpacks, the Pliss, that we're going to wear on our spacesuits when we walked on the moon. So those were full up. So I had lots of oxygen, didn't even bother computing that. The only thing I missed was the lithium cartridges. That was another consumable I didn't even think of. And that was the critical one. So I felt pretty comfortable at that time that we'll at least get back to make an entry. So I did not feel we're ever in what you'd call a hopeless situation throughout the flight. I had confidence also in the system we had. We're in all our training, most of our simulation training involved being tested ourselves and Mission Control with failures. In fact, the majority of our training always had failures to deal with. And so I was confident in our system and the team, and the people were knowledgeable and had the availability of other brain power across the country to call on to help to solve problems. And I knew those without knowing personally who was involved, but I knew a lot of people were back on Earth scrambling and trying to figure things out for us.
That sounds very much like today. Henry wanted to know, is there any part of the Apollo 13 story that you don't often tell?
That I don't often tell.
It's a good question.
No, I think one thing that is not thought of, but I think is true, we lost a crew early. Apollo 1, where a fire erupted when they were in the capsule on the launch pad within a couple of weeks of when they were going to go fly. And we lost that crew in that fire, and of course did a lot of modifications on the spacecraft, most notable a hatch. They could not open the hatch because there was a different variety of plug called a plug hatch. And that whole system was redesigned. So you could quickly open a hatch and get out if that ever happened again. But the other mods they made, not so much publicized, was redo the wiring. And the wiring was extensively redone, completely redone on the command module and the lunar module, which people didn't think of, but that's those same orders, if you will, of how to do the wiring, how to do the clamps on the wiring, the certain round versus egg configuration, how many bundle ties to have every so many inches throughout the wiring bundles, and to hermetically seal the connectors where all the wiring went into connector interfaces, where the plugs that you plug in the wiring. Mm-hmm. And as a result of those fixes, it made the wiring waterproof, as well as free from charring and shorts, but it made them waterproof, even just as important, because in our case, as I said, we not only got cold, water built up everywhere. And and the LEM had no inner wall. We couldn't afford the weight of a wall. It had netting material that kept you kind of from bumping into things, but you could see through the netting at wiring runs and plumbing lines, and at every turn of anything, there was a glob of water sitting. And at every connector interface, there was a glob of water. With the vibration of the glycol pump and the going, that you could, it sort of shimmered there, a little glob of water shimmering. And so we really were saved by the results and findings of the Apollo 1 fire that made those fixes happen, and mainly with the wiring, because I'm sure we'd have had an electric short again.
That's amazing. Colin Martin wanted to ask this question, and I kind of agree that I found the Apollo 13 movie very uplifting about what happened, but he wanted to know how accurate you thought it was, and were there changes that you would have wanted to see in the movie?
Well, changes I might have made would obviously made it more like a pure documentary and would not have been near as interesting. I guess some of the drama that was there that had in various ways, the crew argument, they had us, Jack Swigert and I, arguing about throwing the switch that caused the short. If I had not been still busy cleaning up from the TV show and had been in my normal position in the capsule, I would have thrown the switch, not Jack, to have caused the electric short. There's no way of knowing that was going to happen. Jim Lovell hugging me, me chewing gum before putting the suit on. I didn't ever chew gum. I never chewed gum, and I had this suit tech's hand, that kind of thing. And I questioned Ron about that, and he said, well, so one thing I listened to, and at the same time I questioned, why didn't you use more of our what we said? You had all the air to ground. You had all that radio transmissions. And he said, well, number one, I listened to all of that. I listened to the entire NASA gave me, the air to ground. I listened to it all, and I knew no one would understand what you're talking about. And he said, so the only line in the whole movie was, Houston, we've had a problem here. So at any rate, the second thing on the drama he added in was, he said, well, when I listened to all of that, it never seemed to me you ever had a problem. And so I had to do things like that to make you more human. That was his explanation of the added drama in the movie.
That's amazing.
Now, some of the things he educated me on, though, because I complained about he didn't show a lot of people he probably should have showed in the movie, in the cast. And he said, you know, you got 2 hours, a little over, to make a movie. You can only develop so many characters. And he said that limits you as to who you pick and choose to show in the movie.
Okay. So Nick Porter wanted to know that the Engine 5 failure, who made the decision to keep going or not going after you had that engine failure on the boost up?
Oh, well, there really was no decision about keep going. At the point we were, it made sense without any decisions to keep going, at least try to get to Earth orbit. So the real decision was how much fuel was left or had been used, excess used out of the third stage. Was there enough fuel left with some reserve to commit to that next second use of that engine, the third stage, that would speed us on our way to the moon, that would accelerate us to leave Earth orbit and head out to the moon. So that was some analysis that had to be done on the ground to enable us, to give us the go to execute that next maneuver to leave the Earth.
Okay, there's several questions, and I apologize, everyone. We've got over 85 questions piled up, and I don't think we're going to get through them all. Okay. But I'm going to sort of cluster a couple. There's a couple of questions about, again, you just mentioned it, that from NASA mission control, this is sort of a question from Ted, is that from from the dialogue that you looked like it was all natural and you had no fear, but did you really experience some sort of fear at some point during it, or was it just the disappointment of not getting back down to the moon that was the biggest?
No, there's no fear in that sense. Yeah, people don't realize, but it was same in fighter squadrons. If you say you have fear of not getting back, certainly you have that as a possibility. In fact, you prepare. You normally have a designee. Jerry Carr was mine. That if I did not get, this is before the mission, I had Jerry to my house, talked to him about where papers were, insurance papers, things. And his job was to take care of my wife and family should I not get back. So, and that was pretty normal in a fighter squadron. You normally had a buddy and your best friend normally in a fighter squadron, and I had that same role, which they hoped they would not have to do, but to take care of your family if one day you didn't get back from a flight. So that was pretty customary in the business, I'd say. But no, I was never feared at any point, because again, like I said, I was convinced we would get back to an entry. The biggest question was how the command module would respond when it came back to life. So that was and how the heat shield would be. Frankly, I never thought of that, but some people did on the ground that worried about the heat shield being damaged. And that never occurred to me. But I did worry about how the command module, which I know was we'd kept cold for 4 days, completely turned off, how it would respond and perform when we activated it. So that was kind of my most serious concern, to get us controlled through entry.
So, and this is a related question, and I think this is from Newton, and it goes, clearly you were very confident because you had training, lots of it. So how much, and for all the students, how much training did you do to get to Apollo 13?
How much training? Well, I'd say from a mission standpoint, as I mentioned, I trained for 2 previous missions. I trained to fly to the moon on Apollo 8. Now, not to land, but the one that went into orbit on Christmas in 68. And then I trained again as Buzz Aldrin's backup on Apollo 11. So I was trained to fly that mission if Buzz somehow didn't make it. So I trained through 2 whole mission cycles to go to the moon. So I don't know, I can't tell you offhand how many thousands of hours of training that was, but it was a lot. So yeah, I felt, and each of those times really, I felt ready to go when the day came to launch, even when I wasn't the one who launched.
Carl, I just wanted to know, you showed some great pictures. What was your actual feeling for space? How pretty was it, or how awe-inspiring was your views of space?
I guess going to the moon, I guess to me was, I describe it as just another great adventure for me. From adventures I'd had with airplanes and flying airplanes, like doing Zoom flights in a spacesuit to 80,000 feet in a 104 Starfighter. So this is just another exciting adventure. Now the views were spectacular, as I mentioned in the slideshow. Obviously, in kind of scenes you don't get to see unless you go there, particularly out about the moon. So that was very impressive. I did not have a profound feeling about it, though, say a religious thing, because in the big picture of a little bit of astronomy I had studied, one has to realize that going to the moon is not going very far. It's like one step out of our closet here on Earth. So no, it was not profound. I would say it might have a different effect that way for those who even venture out, say, to Mars, because there'll be many months coasting along on that trip where they can't, everything out around them is nothing but dots of light, including Earth. So they will have, I think, a more profound feeling about being far away. And maybe that would be more psychologically affected on someone on that kind of a trip. We could always see home. I mean, except when we were on the backside of the moon, the Earth was sitting out there. So you really, as I said, you weren't that far away.
Brody and Mason wanted to know why there are so many fuel cells on board.
Why are they what? I'm sorry?
Fuel cells. Why were there the fuel cells there?
Well, it was a system trade for the power on each spacecraft, and based on the length of time they had to operate. Now, the command module was thought of as being like a 2-week vehicle, and the LEM, as I said, was thought to be a 2-day vehicle. And so and that's part of the design evolution. When you're doing design, you do a lot of what we call system trades. And for that length of time, the system trade for the command module for 2 weeks was fuel cells as a more efficient power system, even though it was a little, and weight-wise even, to handle that length of time versus batteries. Have batteries to handle 2 weeks. Conversely, it was just the opposite answer out of the trade studies for the lunar module. It was just more effective for only 2 days to just have batteries and not have the added complexity of fuel cells operating. So that's the way that manifested itself.
Way cool. Angela wanted to know, did any of your family members follow in your footsteps and enter the space exploration or aerospace industry?
No, none of my family did. My oldest daughter went to the dark side, and became a lawyer. And but no, she actually was a pilot. She had a pilot's license before she could drive a car. But I'd hoped she'd go in the military, frankly, because I think women were being allowed into the Air Force at the time to be pilots. I had one son that would have flown, I'm sure, but he wore glasses in high school. And he ended up as a lead electronics technician on aircraft carriers. He was in the first Gulf War on the Midway, then transposed to the Independence aircraft carrier. So he was the only one that came close, I guess you'd say, closest to following in my footsteps.
Well, thank you for his service. Ava wanted to know, was the spacesuit heavy and was it weird sleeping?
The spacesuit was heavy, and particularly considering lunar surface activities, to be wearing that backpack, and on top of it, an OPS, which is an emergency bottle that could handle if you had a small hole in the suit to get back in the limb. If we use that, and I did a couple of times in a chamber on the ground to test my suit, and that we actually had a cable that suspended the weight on a line that could walk around a little bit, but have some of that weight suspended. I don't remember the total weight, but it's several hundred pounds. So 16G was handy to have operating the suit. The other thing in the spacesuit, unless you've been in one, you don't think about, is it's pressurized. It's a pressurized garment, and it's pressurized to be in a certain position, pressurized. So any movement of your arms or your fingers, even when it's pressurized, the gloves, your fingers are in a certain condition. So if you try to grip something, you're having to do work. You're working against the pressure in that glove that's trying to hold it in this position. And the same way with your legs to walk, it's work, because you're moving that stiff pressurized leg you're inside of. And that's why in the moon you saw people very shortly adapted to hopping around, bunny hop sort of thing, as it took less energy and less work to move around that way rather than try to do a normal walking gait, fighting against that hard suit. So, you know, and you develop padding. I had padding on my shoulders from rubbing with the suit. I had wristlings on my wrist because you rub against that metal ring where the glove is attached. And I had pads on the top of my feet because if you did try to walk, you're rubbing the top of your feet against a hard boot. So I had pads on top of my feet on the socks. So gradually, if you worked in a suit a while, you figured out where you're going to add all this padding on the undergarment to protect you from the rubbing and wear and tear with the suit.
Well, thank you. I learned a lot then. I didn't realize that pressurization was an issue. Rob wanted to know that you worked on the shuttle approach and landing tests. Were you expecting to return to space as a shuttle astronaut?
I was, after flying the approach and landing test in 1977, I was assigned commander of the third orbital flight with Jack Blausma was going to fly with me. And we had a very exciting mission we worked on for some time to go up and do a rendezvous carrying a small kick stage or a booster in our payload bay, which Jack would fly over then to dock with Skylab, and we're going to rescue Skylab. Well, either rescue it if they chose to boost it higher, or maybe deorbit it more properly into the Pacific Ocean, say, rather than eventually it fell in with parts going in Australia. So that was the mission. The third mission, the first rendezvous, like I said, go up and offset from Skylab a few hundred feet and fly this booster over to dock and do that mission. Well, unfortunately, Skylab fell in more quickly, and the shuttle launch schedule slipped, went further out.
Yeah.
So that mission went away, and the mission that was left to do just didn't strike me as being that exciting. So I decided at that point I had the opportunity to go, and like I'd always planned, long range, to go into program management, and I joined the Grumman Aircraft Corporation in New York to run space programs in New York for Grumman.
I remember the Skylab falling to the Earth quite vividly. I think I'm going to do one last question here. I apologize that we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but it is almost 1 hour and I want to be respectful for your time. But here is the last question from Ryan. And this is for all the students listening to you. When did you want to become an astronaut, and what sort of things did you do to help lead you to becoming interested in the career with NASA and spaceflight?
Okay. Well, let me start with the career. I sort of accidentally got into the right career path. Like I said, I went in when I was 18 into the NAVCAD program and became a pilot, a naval aviator, and I served in 2 Marine fighter squadrons. And this was before there was a space program. Space program had not evolved at that point, and decided to become a test pilot. Went back to school, to college, to get an engineering degree, which is kind of one of the credentials you need to be a test pilot. And as I said, joined NASA just about the time the space program started with the original 7 astronauts. And I was a test pilot for NASA. I really thought that was it. And most of us did. We said, well, the 7 people were chosen as the first astronauts in the Mercury program, and they're going to go fly these Earth orbital missions and prove humans could survive in space. And that was it. There was nothing at that time, nothing behind Mercury. So it wasn't until John F. Kennedy, the president, made his profound announcement that we're going to the moon within a decade, with very little work having been done in that direction, that it sort of became in the back of my mind something, well, it might be, again, like I said, a great adventure. It might be something exciting. By that time, I had moved on to Edwards Air Force Base. And I was doing some real fun flying. It was probably, from a flying standpoint, it was the most fun, rewarding part of my career at Edwards with NASA there as a test pilot. And I was involved in one way or another, supporting or directly involved in like 3 test programs at the same time, flying lots of different kinds of aircraft. In fact, I showed two slides in a show I did later in years. They wanted me to come back to FRC and talk about the old days, and just 2 charts of my 1 month of my flight log. I had flown 9 different types of aircraft in 1 month. So that was the kind of thing going on there. And I had to think hard because Neil Armstrong, who had gone into the program, visited back at Flight Research Center, and Don Malik and I, another co-pilot of mine, research pilot, got to talking to Neil, and he questioned him, what was it like being an astronaut? Neil's answer was, well, and his little twang answer said, well, you sit in a lot of meetings, you sit in a simulator a lot, and there's not much good flying. And he was comparing it to our days at Edwards, where we're doing all this good flying almost every day. So, because you don't get to go to space every day. And so with that thought, I had to sit back and think. I had to think hard. Should I really leave this and go be an astronaut, with that as the picture Neil gave? And I said, well, on the other hand, if I stay at Edwards, I'm not for sure not going to have a chance to go to the moon. So that was the pull, if you will, that made me apply, and was accepted, and joined the astronaut program in 1966.
Fabulous. So I'm going to end it here, but let me just say to all the students that NASA is reopening up its astronaut program. We expect a lot more persons in space in the next few years, not only through NASA, but through SpaceX and Blue Origin. So keep working at your studies. I was also going to say that a lot of projects, as you were just mentioning, it's like 95% misery, paperwork, meetings, classes you hate, but there's that 5% of glory stuff, which makes it all worth happening. So thank you for your time, Fred. I apologize to everyone we couldn't get to your questions, but this talk will be posted on YouTube video on our channel with your permission. And we hope that people go relook at the Apollo 13 movie to get a really feeling of what you guys did, amazing achievements and accomplishments. So thank you for your time.
Just a minute, I got to show you one thing.
Okay.
Yeah. I just wanted to show everybody my buddy. And he's been listening intently and taking all this in. But anyway, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it very much, and I hope all of you stay safe out there.
Thank you very much, Fred. Appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody's clapping very strongly for you. So thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. We'll stop recording here.